So hello there and welcome back to a brand new episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast, the show where we talk all of the latest news, gossip and events in the world of Formula 1, and we relay that back to you for a bit of healthy banter and discussion for your listening or viewing pleasure, depending of course on which platform you choose to follow us on. And guys, we are here. It seems such a short period of time, but we are already at the season finale at Abu Dhabi, and what a blockbuster of a race that we have got in store in this Formula 1 World Championship. We have two rivals going back and forth throughout the entire season, loaded with controversy, incredible moments and brilliant pieces of driving, but only one can be world champion. On the one side, we have the seven-time world champion, Lewis Hamilton, going for an unprecedented 8th world title, which would set him above anybody else the sport has ever seen to cement his already incredible legacy. And up against him, we have the young pretender, the challenger, the lion, Max Verstappen, going for his first world title. Who will come out on top? We're going to have to wait and see by the end of this Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. But in the meantime, we're going to preview this race with all its controversial moments upcoming and find out who we think is going to become the Formula 1 World Champion for 2021. As always, joining me on this episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast is my co-host returning this week, Courtney Pine. Courtney, I hope you're feeling well after a nice break last weekend. How are you doing?
Oh, Adam, I'm doing great. I have a lot to say, obviously, not only because of the last race, but I really am buzzing for this race. I think F1 fans have been waiting a long time to see two top draw drivers facing each other in teams with fairly equal machinery. And I just think the whole situation is amazing for F1 in general. And, we wouldn't be doing this podcast if we weren't so passionate about Formula 1. So this is great for us. It really is.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't say it better myself, and I'm incredibly excited as well. And I definitely want to get into this preview as well. But of course, before we do that, I want to introduce a very, very special guest, someone that I'm very excited to have on the show. And it's fitting that we have him on for our season finale preview, if you like. A young man who's been making waves on the esports scene for his audio commentary, which I have to say, and I hope I'm not fanboying too much here, but it is definitely up there with some of the best that I have heard. And I certainly hope that this young man does make waves into even Formula 1 one day. I know he certainly has those lofty ambitions, and I certainly hope we'll hear more of him on that scene very, very soon. But nonetheless, of course, without any further introduction, we are joined by George Morgan. George, thank you so much for spending time with us to discuss this Abu Dhabi preview. How are you doing, and are you looking forward to the race this weekend?
No, I'm not looking forward to it at all. No, what am I saying? No, of course I am. Of course I'm looking forward to it. Thank you for having me as well, Adam. It's a pleasure to be here, and obviously Courtney as well. Pleasure to meet you both. Really excited for the weekend. I think we're going to be in for a real barnstormer. I think obviously we've just come off the back of a bit of a mental weekend. I think I made a sort of an opinion or sort of an expression as to what last weekend was like. It was almost like a heavy night on the sesh. Waking up the following day with a hangover and sort of minor flashbacks as to what happened the night before. That was kind of how I felt on Monday morning, I have to say. But yeah, no, it was incredible to say the least, and I enjoyed every moment of it.
Yeah, absolutely lovely analogy. I don't think I could have put that better myself, to be honest. I mean, I probably could go a little bit further, but I want to try and keep this podcast PG as best as I can, so I think I'll leave that one alone.
Wise choice.
Yeah, very wise choice. Judging by some of the stuff I said on last week's episode, I probably didn't make the best impression with some of the comment section. We did notice, for a lot of you that probably said you weren't going to tune into us ever again and decided to have a look because you were curious to see how we'd handle this. But we hear you. All I can say to you that did comment and engage with us in an open-minded discussion is, it's fantastic. We love having you on board. And of course, we look forward to more of that. But for the rest of you, the minority, I should say, obviously not to single out too many, that, how can I put this the right way? Express their emotion and passion in a very fiery manner, fitting of what we saw this weekend. I understand it, but I will say that you don't always have to respond to every time you don't agree with someone. And look, if you want to express your passion for the sport, that's absolutely fantastic. All I ask is that if you don't agree with what we're saying and you want to kind of challenge us on it, by all means, be my guest. But if you're going to say stuff like you're biased or you don't know what you're talking about or your guests are a joke, I'm not going to give it the time of day. So, anyway, look, public service announcement and whinge aside, let's get right into this. Now, George, of course, as I'd already mentioned, your forte, your passion for motorsport extends as far as being involved as a commentator and also for esports particularly as well. For the benefit of our listeners who may not be too familiar with the esports scene or how to be a commentator on the esports scene, what made you want to get involved into that scene, and what is esports to you as a broadcaster and commentator?
For me, it's a growing industry. It's growing every day without fail. I mean, I think if you compare to when I first came in, which is approximately that'll be 2 to 3 years ago now, we have seen such an exponential rise in how far it has come, and it's every day and every event becoming more and more professional. The prize money is shooting upwards, and sponsors are taking greater notice. For me, finding my way into commentary was totally by accident, believe it or not. Really not expected. It's sort of branched off from when I first started racing with my friends on a Friday afternoon, where we would just get together Friday evening, just for a laugh. We'd get together and just get on a voice chat on the PlayStation, start playing Formula One, create a little league in amongst ourselves, which me personally, I wasn't the quickest of drivers. I used to languish behind, maybe a second or 2 seconds behind the whole pack. So I sort of thought to myself, I'm getting pretty fed up with this. So I said, is there anything else I can do? And they said, well, how about you commentate? And I said, oh, fair enough, I'll do that then. So it all stemmed from that, really. And it was all a bit of fun. And then I started having, other eSport league organizations approached me then, asking me to do different bits and bobs. And eventually that led me to an organization called ORL, which pretty much put me out front and center with the best in the world in terms of F1 esports talent. And since then, of course, I've been in PSGL and WOR, of course, as well. So, I've been very fortunate to some extent. I've struggled to understand a lot of the reasons why it's gone the way it's gone, but at the same time, it's been a fun ride.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting that you should allude on that, because I've sort of been keeping an eye, particularly with PSGL, that you've been heavily involved in as well. And obviously you were quite, I suppose, animated and passionate about the direction that it had gone, not necessarily for the better. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the league PSGL, I mean, we're talking some serious names. Jarno Otmir, for example, Freddie Rasmussen, just to name drop a few. That people will be familiar with in the esports scene for F1 right now. So it's really big time stuff. I suppose, I had very, very limited experience as an esports commentator. Again, it was restricted mostly to PlayStation online leagues. And there is certainly an art to commentary. There's certainly a way to go about it. It's not necessarily being passionate and shouting at a computer screen, thinking everyone's like, oh, you have the Sebastian Vettel moment in Belgium a few years ago. That famous old clip, here comes Sebastian Vettel. As amazing, as exciting as that is, there's always a bit more to it than just that. As a commentator, what would you say to people? How would you describe to people what the art of commentary is to you? What do you feel that is the most important thing about being a good commentator?
The ability to narrate, I think, is important. And I think if you can probably compare and contrast it to like theatre and also, stage acts, you've got the person on the side who sort of narrates to the audience, tells them what's going on, type of thing. It's all about storytelling as well. I think it's very much almost like a performance. You put it together at the same time. You want the audience to be hooked and invested in what they're watching. I always say to people when they ask me, what is my style? Obviously I'm a play-by-play commentator, but a lot of it is an extension of my personality as well. So the way I feel about Formula One is basically what you're seeing, but dialed up to 10 or whatever it might be. It's just me, sort of unleashing what I'm seeing, what I'm feeling while watching a race. And esports has been such a brilliant way of using that and sort of discovering that. My style hasn't changed since I started. I mean, if you went back to the first day I did commentary, there are streams that do exist on YouTube of my first ventures into commentary, and I look back then and now, and the catchphrases I use are pretty much the same. I still used pedal to the metal, go, 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 go in the very first broadcast, so nothing has changed since then. So obviously as I've gone on, I've sort of become a little bit more slick and a little bit more on the ball ironed out a lot of creases, as you would do. Naturally at the start, you're not going to be all brilliant and amazing at it. It takes time. Obviously, doing 5 to 6 broadcasts a week helped back in the early days because it got you ingrained into how the process works. But, I'd say it's be natural. Being natural is very, very important, which is something I've always sort of insisted on. I don't go out there pretending to be somebody else or somebody that I'm not, because it's pointless at that point. And people can find that out very easily if you're trying to be someone you're not. One thing I can tell the people, and one thing I can guarantee on, is every time I do a commentary broadcast, it is, totally, literally neutral, and it's just me being me, essentially. So that's the big secret.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, to be honest. That was actually going to be my follow-up question. I think the most important thing is you have to be yourself. If you have to dial it up to 11, as you said, then, that's great. But I've often felt that there are some, not necessarily esports commentators, even some in the mainstream to a degree, that they pick up certain mannerisms or phrases that you hear from some of the elite commentators. We're talking Murray Walker, David Croft, Alex Jakes, just to name drop a few involved in Formula One. And the catchphrase you mentioned, pedal to the metal, is something that I've heard you say quite a lot and is intrinsic with who you are as a commentator. And then you'll have the lights out and away we go, which Crofty has made famous. And so many people try to use that, not necessarily it's a good thing. They want to use that. That's fine. But when it comes to establishing an identity, you can't go wrong with just being yourself. And I think that's something that I've found in the best commentators. That's something that they adopt better than the rest. In terms of interviews itself, of course, you've been involved in quite a few esports shows. I'm right in thinking that you recently interviewed Max Verstappen, although after, of course, you unmuted yourself originally. Not to embarrass you too much, George, but what was that like to potentially got an interview with the next Formula One world champion?
It was totally a spur of the moment type thing. I actually only knew I was going to be interviewing literally seconds before we did the interview. We only found out just before the broadcast that he was actually racing, for starters. So, obviously it was quite a big buzz knowing that I would be potentially commentating over Max Verstappen, which I eventually did, of course. And that was a pleasure, to say the least, just to say his name in a commentary sense, in a broadcast like that, because I'd always wondered what it would sound like if I was to take my voice to, say some of the stars of today, because as you would, we're all fans of motor racing. We all watch the sport. So it's a bit like when you're in your back garden when you're a kid and you're shooting in your football goalposts and saying Thierry Henry or something like that, and doing that, So it's, for me, it's almost like unleashing my inner kid, so to speak, or inner child, so to say. But no, and then finding out that hearing the producer in my ear suddenly say, right, Max Verstappen for an interview, Ben and George, you're up. I was like, what? I was like, oh my God. So yeah, that was pretty crazy. So I wasn't prepared for it, to be honest with you. I had no plans what I was going to say. I mean, I literally, everything I said was pretty much done on the spot, from where you saw it. But, they were questions, obviously, that I was very keen to ask. And obviously, I didn't want to touch on Formula One while we were on the VCO Pro Sim broadcast, because it was all about VCO Pro Sim and it was all about Team Redline that night. I don't think it would have been immensely respectful of me to quote another series, whether it be Formula One or not, when it's a VCO Pro Sim series broadcast on iRacing. So it's better to keep it to the subject, to the point. And we got to hear a little bit more about Max Verstappen's passions of sim racing as well, which I think is a very different way or a different view from one of the greatest superstars in the world right now. I think it's really enlightening.
Yeah, it certainly was. When I watched the interview, I'm not going to lie. I mean, I can't say I've followed Max's sim racing ventures too much. I was aware of his work with Team Redline, obviously Lando Norris's involvement as well, who has also helped to pioneer the esports scene and merge that between that and Formula One. I always found it quite interesting that when I was listening to that interview, George, that we got to learn a bit more about Max the person. I think that's something we don't often see in Formula One. They are trying to, how can I put this? not necessarily add a personality to these guys because they all have one, but it's something that we never saw often with our heroes from F1 in the 90s and the early noughties. It's very much the social media age where we try to learn a bit more about the drivers, but even then there's always that wall of media protection or PR reps, etc., etc., so they can only say so much. It was actually really nice to see, in a way, Max Verstappen just chilling at home on his sim rig and just being himself. I think if more people saw that sort of thing with some of the other drivers as well, it would help them connect a little bit more, which is always great to see. I suppose now that we're going to move on to the F1 part in just a moment, obviously you've got quite a busy year ahead of you, George. Am I allowed to ask if you're able to sort of give a little bit of a teaser of some of the stuff you're going to be involved in, just for the benefit of our listeners that might want to check you out next year?
Well, there's a lot on the table. I mean, there's a lot of stuff's going to happen next year. I can't necessarily go in and divulge too much, but obviously I've signed with Loudspeaker, which is no big secret, this year, and that's that was a great moment for me to do that, because obviously Loudspeaker now be one of the most exciting new agency that's come out in terms of broadcasters and presenters, and since I don't know when. I mean, obviously my knowledge in that won't be as great as some other people, but Loudspeaker themselves, they have such an incredible roster of talent on there, many of them already and currently commentating for Sky Sports and obviously for IndyCar as well, and various others, Formula Regional Alpine. You've got the likes of Chris McCarthy, Tom Gamore's on there as well as many others. Ben Constanduros, who I was commentating with in the VCO Pro Sims in it as well, and he's a very accomplished commentator for endurance racing, GT3 racing, as well as esports now as well. He's really adapted to esports incredibly well as Ben. He's been sensational. But there's going to be lots of stuff happening next year, and I'm pleased to say that it's going to be a combination of real life and esports next year. So really exciting. I've yet to do real life commentary. I'm very keen to do it. It was obviously, since the progression has happened with esports and the things we've done with league racing, it sort of came into my mindset that maybe real life stuff would be a possibility, but now it really seems like it's going to be more than a possibility for next year. So yeah, really excited about it.
No, well, that's fantastic to hear. And all I can say is I wish you the best of luck with that, George. And I can't wait to see and hear, of course, what you're going to be getting up to next year. It certainly sounds exciting. And of course, we'll leave links to your socials. And I believe you have a channel as well, right?
Yeah, I've got a YouTube channel, which is, to be honest with you, is quite informal. I don't classify myself as a YouTuber because I tend to be quite sporadic with it. I'm not overly on the ball. Schedule and me is just a dirty word. I'm terrible with it. It's just awful. I can't schedule anything on YouTube to save my life. Apart from the leagues, I obviously cover, of course. But you can obviously check me out. There's lots of content on there at George Morgan TV. You can find me on YouTube. It's the same name as what's on my Instagram and my Twitter as well. So yeah, I'm all about the place. I'm everywhere.
It's brilliant to see. But of course, yeah, we'll leave links in the description for those of you watching this on YouTube. And of course, as George mentioned, you can check him out on his socials as well. Definitely recommend it. Really great stuff. And sounds like an exciting 2022 for you, George. Of course, we've got the small matter of previewing the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. As much as I'd love to continue the interview, I think some of our followers was like, get on with the race review, Ed. Otherwise, you're going to be fanboying another guest on your show, which I tend to have a habit of, I'm afraid. So I do apologise for that. If you don't believe me, just ask Matt Gallagher. He still hasn't replied to my Instagram. No, to be fair, he's great actually. Yeah. Anyway, let's get on with the Abu Dhabi preview. Now, of course, we've got the small matter of finding out who's going to be the world champion in 2021. Is it going to be Lewis Hamilton, who seems to have so many trophies now? He must have a house dedicated to just being his own private trophy room. And then, of course, Max Verstappen, who is chasing his very first world title. And that's a really crazy thing because, we've often talked Max up quite a bit on this show, and it's quite easy to see why. The success that he's had for such a young age, it feels like he's been around forever in Formula One. But the one thing that still eludes him is a world title. And it always seems inevitable that he's going to get one. But is it going to be this year? And now both drivers level on points. It seemed after Mexico, Max was going to run away with this world title, and Lewis bit by bit has clawed him back. We said, Courtney, a few weeks ago that Lewis had 4 cup finals to win this World Championship. He's managed to get 3 of them.
Yeah.
The Jeddah one seemed to be one of the hardest ones of the lot under the circumstances. Of course, he had that incredible comeback in Brazil. But now we're here at Abu Dhabi, both drivers level on points. The momentum very much seems to be with Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes. If possible, how can you summarise what your thoughts are going into this weekend's race? Do you feel that Lewis is the favourite for this title? Or do you feel that there's still one more sting in the tail that could swing it in Max Verstappen's direction?
Well, I mean, it'd be foolish for me to make a bold prediction given what we've had this season. But it just seems that Mercedes have figured a few things out, particularly with the race pace. They just seem to be a lot more comfortable. And Lewis's form sort of reminds me of his form in 2016 after, when he had the DNF in Malaysia, which, we thought was all going to end his championship charge. I think he went on to win every other race after that. And we're seeing something similar happen here. And, I'd like briefly say about, I've seen the new layout in Abu Dhabi, and I just feel that it should suit the characteristics of the Mercedes. But, I mean, we'd be foolish to rule out somebody like Max Verstappen. I have my opinions on his driving style sometimes, which I'm sure we'll get into later. But in terms of the raw talent, you cannot deny how talented the guy is. And I think it's going to be a very tight race. And let's hope it goes to the very end.
It's almost a bit like the immovable force meets the unstoppable object. Or what I've actually vice versa. It doesn't really matter. But people know what I mean. It does have this feeling that, you go into a huge event like this. It's almost like a boxing fight where you've got 2 fighters that are undefeated. And you can't really pick which one's going to win. I mean, we'll find out come this Sunday, but I certainly have this feeling that there's always going to be one more thing that we're going to be talking about. I just certainly hope it's going to be a moment of brilliance for either one of them, or maybe both. Not necessarily a moment of controversy that we've been so used to when it comes to these two when they lock horns. George, I suppose from what you've told us before you joined us on the show, you're as far neutral as we're ever going to get in terms of Formula One. You don't really have a stake in this, which is, it's always a good thing because we can't ever be accused of being biased when we're completely neutral. But that being said, where are your thoughts at this weekend? Courtney's mentioned already that the track changes that have been made specifically for this year to increase overtaking and make the race more exciting may tend to swing towards Mercedes to be perhaps more of a front limited circuit when in recent years it's been a rear limited circuit. Or do you feel that perhaps Max Verstappen still has what it takes to bypass all of that and still get the result which eventually will crown him as a world champion?
Well, as my occupation is a professional fence sitter, obviously I'm not going to go into certainly go into it, despite me being a professional fence sitter, should I say, I do sort of swing to the Mercedes side on this one. I'll be quite honest with you, because of the track changes. I think it does, quite rightly, Courtney is right, it does suit Mercedes in my view as well. I think what they've done at the point of the Ferrari World hairpin, I think is quite a major part of the circuit. I think we'll be seeing a lot of overtakes heading down to that point. And then, of course, you've still got the winding sections, I think, coming into Sector 3 as well, which I think would probably is where Red Bull are going to be more effective, I think. I think Mercedes did a very clever thing by making that last power unit change for Lewis at the point that they did, because obviously it gave them a little bit of extra power coming into the final stages of the championship. And you sort of get the feeling that was a premeditated thought, a premeditated move. They knew that they were going to get a little bit more out of the car than maybe Red Bull would. So I think it was a bit of a combination. Obviously, Lewis himself is a quality driver, so is Max. But I think what Mercedes have done as a team, I think, is just tip the scale slightly more into Lewis's favour in that sense. And if I'm honest with you, my presumption, should everything go as it should, without any incident, shall we say? Obviously, we've just come off the back of Saudi Arabia. I say we're going to be crowning Lewis Hamilton an 8 times world champion.
And as a hardcore Michael Schumacher fan, I have to say that it's definitely going to be a hard pill to swallow. But nonetheless, records are made to be broken. And it's probably the only one Michael has left that Lewis hasn't taken from him. So, that's how it goes in sport. Michael said it himself. I think he said once that these records are going to be broken, and he did earmark Lewis as a potential driver that could do that. So it's kind of nice that one's almost come home to roost a little bit. But it's quite interesting because we've got this dynamic right now where we've got two drivers who have had contrasting fortunes and levels of performance throughout the season, and when they've come together, there always seems to be controversy shrouded in it, whether it was the incident in Silverstone, the one in Monza, what we saw at Brazil, and of course Jeddah as well. It just feels like perhaps we're going to get that one more time. And of course with that comes the fear of a scenario where, not necessarily implying that one of them will, but there is the possibility that we could have an incident where they come together and it ends up deciding the championship. Now, I know a lot of people have earmarked Max Verstappen as a potential culprit, primarily because he's the driver that has the most to gain from a scenario that ends up with both drivers ending up in the wall, meaning that if neither of them score points, Max Verstappen's world champion. I think if Lewis comes ninth and Max gets the fastest lap in 10th, he's world champion. I think that's the only scenario I can think of where Lewis beats him in the race and doesn't win the title. But Courtney, we've talked about this a lot with Max Verstappen. His aggressive driving style, some of the things, the inconsistencies, I suppose, with the stewards over some of the decisions that they've made regarding how to penalise Max. Do you feel there's a genuine fear that unless the stewards preemptively put in a policy to ward either of them off of a collision, is there a genuine fear that Max could possibly do something to swing the championship his way in terms of a collision with Lewis, or do you feel that might be a bit too harsh to imply that he could do something like that?
I think it depends on how the race itself goes. I think we saw in Jeddah, I mean, now we had time to sort of calm down from the moment itself. There was a sort of like a boiling pot during that race. There was just so many sort of tedious decisions going on with the stewards, between the teams, that I'm not actually surprised that we saw some of the incidents happen between the two drivers. I think they both felt hard done by for different reasons. And then that's why we saw the coming together. I think also with Max, I've always been an admirer of his raw talent. I think he brings a lot to Formula One, and I do think he's going to be the driver of his generation. But there have been a lot of comparisons between Max right now and the Lewis Hamilton that we remember at McLaren. And for me, I've discussed this with you previously, Adam. I don't feel that Max Verstappen has been managed very well. I think we saw some similar things with Lewis Hamilton. I think particularly in 2011 when Lewis Hamilton had a really poor season, constantly tangling with Felipe Massa, for example. And I think that was a moment when Lewis said, you know what, I need to go to a new team in order to mature. And we saw that. We saw more mature Lewis Hamilton at Mercedes. And I'm not saying that Max Verstappen needs to leave Red Bull right away, but I do believe long term, Max Verstappen will become a better driver if he's in an environment that will help him mature more.
Yeah, I think Anthony Davison kind of summed this up really, really well. I remember him saying, I think it was the Spanish Grand Prix early in the season when Max dived one up the inside of Lewis Hamilton, and it was quite an aggressive overtake, but it was one where Lewis did have to take evasive action to avoid a contact between the two, one that he would have come out second best on. And he said it felt a lot, what we were seeing seemed that we were seeing Lewis Hamilton, a 36-year-old, 7-time Formula One world champion, obviously by then hadn't won 100 Grand Prix yet, but all the experience that he had against Max Verstappen, a 24-year-old racing driver going for his first world title, who seemed to be driving a lot like a 24-year-old Lewis Hamilton after he'd was at the point where he'd won his first world title. There was a lot of raw talent there, incredible speed and pace, to which we'd only seen a handful of times from a few other drivers in F1's history. But there was always that tendency to perhaps go for moves or be a bit too aggressive and put yourself at risk where you lend yourself to the other driver to avoid an accident. And perhaps that's what we're seeing a little bit more throughout this season. We're still seeing a bit more of that where Lewis is adopting a style to go against that, where he's thinking, right, well, if Max is going to go all in, I'll just make sure I don't make contact, live to fight another day, and then get the result, which Lewis has been so good at. George, I'm going to throw the difficult question your way, as I just did with Courtney. Do you feel there might be a fear that perhaps with these two styles coming together that we may see an incident that may require Lewis Hamilton to take evasive action to avoid a collision? Or do you feel that perhaps Max might use this to his advantage, knowing that if he does try to throw up the inside of Lewis, he knows that Lewis will have to take avoiding action, because if he doesn't and contact is made, it could be World Championship over for Lewis.
Yeah, I think the one crazy thing about this race, and certainly with them being level on points, there is so many scenarios that can come out of this race, and I'm telling you now that it's not just down to Lewis and Max, believe it or not. If you look at it, you've still got Valtteri Bottas and Sergio Perez. Now, I'm not insinuating anything in saying this, but I mean, what is stopping Red Bull perhaps saying to Sergio, make Lewis's life a little bit difficult at Yas Marina this weekend? I mean, I'm not saying that is the case, but I'm just saying that it's there and out in front and center on the table. At the end of the day, these are scenarios that could happen. At the end of the day, what's the worst thing that can happen? Red Bull might get disqualified from the Constructors' Championship if Perez was to do something untoward, but that wouldn't necessarily cost Max anything because he wasn't the one who made the crucial impact at that time. So he could come away champion off the back of that. And don't forget as well, he still effectively could win the championship on countback as well. That's another thing that we need to obviously assess as well. But obviously, anything can happen. I do agree with you as well, contrasting styles to an extent. Lewis obviously trying to be maybe the kryptonite to Max Verstappen's very, I suppose, young, aggressive nature as a driver. I mean, we've seen drivers perform that way over the years. Schumacher, of course, was like it. We all remember Adelaide between him and Damon Hill, and obviously what happened at Jerez between him and Jacques Villeneuve as well. This is the type of racing we've seen so many years now, for so many years. I think the only difference, and I think what shocks people a lot more, is the fact that these cars are now 1,000 brake horsepower and are a lot bigger. They're almost twice the size of the cars that were back in the 90s. So obviously it throws that greater risk element into it as well. It'll be interesting to say the least, but I don't think we can just squarely look at it as a Max and Lewis issue. I think we need to look at the wider field here, because I think there's lots of things that could implicate the results of the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix this weekend.
And that's a really good point, actually, bringing up Perez. And of course, Bottas as well. It's his final race for Mercedes. And I'm sure from what you see from Valtteri, there's no bitterness towards Mercedes over the fact that he's not going to be with the team. Obviously, it was their decision to not continue his contract, but he has a very successful tenure with the team. He's won the Constructors' Championship every season he's been there. He's been a huge part of that. It's not been just the Lewis Hamilton show, although you can understand why some people may feel that way. Just
for me to just bump in on that, I heard a crazy stat the other day with regards to Valtteri Bottas. In the entire time he's been at Mercedes, he has always got into Q3 without fail.
Yeah, wasn't it?
Throughout his entire tenure.
I think it was. He was only the third driver to make 100 consecutive top 10 qualifying results. I think only Alain Prost and Ayrton Senna, when they were teammates, managed to do that back in the late 80s, which is incredible.
That is some stat, isn't it? That is really an incredible stat. Yeah.
And this is the funny thing about Valtteri Bottas, and I think we might move the conversation a little bit to him before we go back to Max and Lewis, because, it's a big day for Valtteri. It's his final race for Mercedes. Of course, the objective for him is a simple one. If you can win the race, great, but the main objective is to try and help Lewis beat Max. If you can kill two with one, that's fantastic for Valtteri, but of course, he will want Lewis, his teammate, a good friend of his, I'd imagine. Lewis has always had such nice things to say about Valtteri. And in a way, this could potentially be the last opportunity Valtteri may get in his career to win a Grand Prix or even get a podium, with all due respect to Alfa Romeo. So for him, we just talked about his qualifying powers. And in a way, you could argue he's probably one of a very, very highly classed qualifiers, just because he's been up against the greatest qualifier of all time. He's been made to look almost mediocre. But and that would not be doing him a fair service, would it, George?
No. I mean, if you look at what he can bring to the table, I fancy Mercedes to go greater than Red Bull in the Constructors. And that's only based off what we've seen from Perez, I think, this season. I don't think we've seen him have the impact at Red Bull like Valtteri has had at Mercedes. And I think that if you're talking about Constructors' Championships, you need both drivers performing, getting podiums. it's no good if one driver performs. Obviously, Max has been the one that's been performing for Red Bull. We haven't really seen, don't get me wrong, Perez has pulled off some really, really great performances this season, but at the same time, it's that consistency element that is so vital to winning Constructors' Championships. And I get the feeling that certainly with the improvements that Merc have made, I think obviously since the power unit change in Lewis's car, as well as their aerodynamics and the extra speed they're finding, Christian Horner has been very open with the fact that Mercedes do have that greater speed. I really can see Bottas being exceptionally good at Abu Dhabi this weekend. I would not be surprised to see him up there. And I think that will prove to be the difference maker when it comes to deciding a Constructors' Champion. Myself. So he's got a lot to offer the team towards the tail end, and he couldn't wish for a better end to his Mercedes tenure, in my personal opinion. I also think he's going to be incredible at Alfa Romeo next season. So, because he's going to have the power with the new team as well. So, yeah, I don't think he gets a fair rub of the green sometimes myself.
No, and I don't either. I'm a big fan of Valtteri's, and I think sometimes his race pace, obviously it's not up there with Lewis, but then whose race pace is up there with Lewis? There's only one driver matching him stride for stride at the moment. And, you have to say with someone like Valtteri that I really, really hope he does well next year. I mean, he's kind of similar to what Sebastian Vettel was embarked on with Aston Martin, that medium-term plan with a new project. Perhaps not the buzz and excitement that Aston Martin would bring naturally, but of course, their trajectory and potential seems a lot higher at this point in time. We'll just have to wait and see how that pans out. But
just to go back on that point, I mean, we've seen what experienced drivers can do with teams. Arguably, you could say that Michael Schumacher was behind the success of Mercedes. I mean, he was there prior to Lewis joining, and again formulated the team that would go on to become the dominant constructor that we have known for so many years. So, I think what Alfa Romeo have got is really exciting.
And as a Schumacher fan, I'm really glad to hear you say that. I'm almost tempted to ask, does Schumacher get any assists for Lewis's titles? But it's probably not.
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe, but then that's probably an argument for another day. I'm trying to hold on to whatever I can with Michael, but I just feel it's just slipping away, and this is the final nail for that one. But no, it's incredible what we've seen from Lewis Hamilton, and it's only going to get stronger for the longer it stays in the sport. But yeah, it's exciting to think what the roles the number two drivers could play. And there was that period in the middle of the season where I think it was like 5 or 6 races after Silverstone where Perez only scored 16 points, which, is not good enough in the car that he has had this season, and ultimately has proven to be quite pivotal in this Constructors' Championship battle. There's still a chance for Red Bull to overturn it, but at the moment, I would say it would be very difficult to see Mercedes relinquishing a 28-point lead with one race to go. Courtney, you look like you want to sort of dive in on this.
Yeah.
So I'm going to give you the floor.
I think we're talking about who's going to make the bigger impact. I think the biggest problem with Sergio Perez has been his qualifying. He always seems to sort of slowly build into the weekend. He's always way off the pace in practice. Qualifying, I don't think he's been good enough, but he does have good race pace. And the problem is that by the time you can have the good race pace, but if he's like stuck behind the McLaren, for example, we know how difficult the McLarens have been to overtake this season, generally speaking. So he hasn't really been able to have an impact in as many races as Valtteri has. I think, it's one of the reasons why Lewis is probably in this position, because even if he's been able to hold Max Verstappen up for a few laps, I think Valtteri's been able to. I'll look at maybe Turkey. I think Turkey's the only race really where I think Perez has been able to hold up Lewis. Other than that, I think Valtteri's been a lot more consistent in qualifying, and I think that'll be the case this weekend as well.
Yeah, I mean, you could throw back Ewan as well if you want to, but even then, it wasn't really holding Lewis up. He was quicker than Lewis. He's just, obviously, things happened the way that they did, but you're right, Corny. It's kind of that job where the number two drivers haven't necessarily been a buffer, if you like, for the number one counterparts on the other side, as much as you'd probably think they would, but you do feel that Perez this season has not put himself in the best position to try and help Red Bull as much in terms of helping Max. Hopefully next season, we will see a much more comfortable, a much better Sergio Perez, but then we could end up in a scenario like Mercedes have with Bottas, where we don't tend to see the best of him until he has the security of a long, medium-term contract underneath him, where we're saying, oh, hold on, where's this guy been? If he was driving the car now the way he was now, he'd still be in the team. So there's always that paradox that comes with it. But bringing it back to Lewis and Max, if I may, I do want to talk a little bit about Max Verstappen. We touched on some of the aggressive driving that we've mentioned in a few races recently. And we had that huge incident where Max was trying to let Lewis overtake him, and then, of course, the both of them at the same time had their thoughts based on the DRS that they were approaching for the next corner. And then, of course, it just went back and forth. It was a complete mess until Max slammed on the brakes and Lewis just happened to be right behind him, caused that crash. I'm not going to get into that, so don't worry about that because that's a potentially fiery one. But as a whole, no matter which way you want to rationalise it, as a whole, it's another incident where Max Verstappen, in particular, has been questioned on his driving style and the way that he feels that his aggressiveness is something that the stewards seem to punish one day and not the other, to the point where even he is confused. I was watching Jolyon Palmer's analysis for F1 on this, and he actually said something that rang quite true to me, and I think is a fair point. He said that Max Verstappen's style of driving has often been aggressive throughout his entire F1 career. So that he's been the driver that people tend to bring up more than most when it comes to not necessarily doing dirty driving, but sometimes going a bit over the limit and, causing incidents as and when they occur. And he said that that's something that's been going on throughout his entire career. The problem, in his opinion, is that, and I share this as well, I should stress, is that the stewards haven't really done a good job to police this on a consistent basis as well as they have done. But by extension to that, the fan base, years ago when Max was younger, was saying, oh, this kid's aggressive, he's a breath of fresh air. It's kind of bringing that old style of racing back into the modern world, which, in fairness, is probably not as welcome as it once was, probably because of what you said, George, about the cars being a lot heavier, a lot more robust, there's a lot more forces involved with some of these impacts, and perhaps we're aware of them more than we used to be when the cars were much lighter. And there's certain incidents that Max has been involved in when he was younger, in his early Red Bull days, that people were thinking, well, it was in the middle of the field, no one really cared for it so much, we just got on with it. Or I remember Vettel moaning about him in the Ferrari, Raikkonen or Leclerc, and people were saying, oh, well, they just need to suck it up and get on with it. Max is just, it's just hard racing. But now Max is in a position to win a championship. Max is competing against Lewis Hamilton, and this is not comparing Lewis to other drivers, this is just because Lewis is in that position. All of a sudden, the spotlight is on Max. Everybody's watching what he's doing. So every time he goes a bit aggressive or over the limit, everyone's asking, well, why are the stewards not punishing this? And my argument would be, well, until you start setting precedents where you police this on a regular basis throughout his entire career, you're not really going to get change. I can understand why Max feels like his driving should be fine and that the stewards, it's confusing him why the stewards are penalising him, because this is something they've not really done much. I think there's one time where they actually set a precedent with Max, and that was the old Verstappen rule, where you weren't allowed to move under braking. And the only driver I remember that got punished for that was Sebastian Vettel, I think back in Mexico a few years ago. But even then, it was one of those where once they established that rule, Max stopped doing it and then started changing the way that he drives for the better. Are we in a situation now that I think the stewards and the FIA need to start putting some precedents in place, maybe not necessarily targeting Max, but looking at certain things that he may do, for example, the weaving on the straight, forcing drivers off to defend like he did in Jeddah and at Brazil. One was penalised, one wasn't, the contrast there. In order to get to a position where not necessarily just him, but other drivers on the grid now and ones coming up looking at what Max are doing and probably thinking, well, if he can get away with it, why can't we? I know there's quite a lot to go on, a bit of a monologue, but what are your thoughts on this one, guys? George, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely spot on with what you're saying about the stewarding and the FIA ruling on it. I think, if anything, Max and Lewis, with their battles this season, have sort of highlighted the issues. I think in the steward's office, it's exposed their frailties, I think, in decision making. I myself was expecting Max to receive a penalty for Brazil. I was actually shocked when I saw that no investigation would be made into that. I was blown away by it, because at the end of the day, for me, it looked pretty clear. And I when Michael Massey sort of made the call afterwards saying that we've looked at it and all that, I just couldn't understand where that rationale came from. For me, it was a straight up penalty. But then this is the problem. See, there's a lot of confusion, no doubt, in the drivers' minds, because I don't think they know how far they can push, and that for me stems down to the fact that there is no dedicated, standardized rule of policing these moves, and that for me is a big issue. I mean, I thought especially Michael Massey offering deals, using the word deals to teams, during the race was very suspect. I mean, saying words like that when you're an official race director, or if anything, a bit like referees in football, if you started throwing around terms like that, you'd be in trouble for disrepute, bringing the sport into disrepute. So I personally, I'm flabbergasted at some of the decisions that are being made at the moment. I mean, obviously, if there is any rationale, I'm obviously happy to listen to that. But, I just feel that it could be that some of the moves I think that people are seeing, and obviously social media is massive now, and everyone can have an opinion. This is why Max's driving style, I think, ultimately is being scrutinized a lot more, because people now are able to have their opinions and they're on publicly. I'm sure if social media was around back in the 90s, we'd be hearing all about Michael Schumacher's exploits out on track, as well as
we do. That's the funny thing.
His great moments. Well, we do. Yeah. People go back and watch the old races and they come out and say, "Oh yeah, what about what he did in Adelaide? God, he was a dirty driver." Now all of a sudden, Michael Schumacher's history has been tainted by the very, by the very, ability to broadcast your comments on social media. You can argue that Ayrton Senna did it for what he did to Alan Prost. I mean, need I say more? I mean, it's the way the sport is. But unless you've got an official dedicated team that are policing these issues, and stopping them right at the root, then the drivers are just going to keep doing what they're doing. And Fernando Alonso said it exactly right. I think it was him anyway, after Brazil, that said, well, if that's the way that they're doing things, then, we'll all do it. We'll all push the limits. That's the nature of it. And unless it is stopped from the root of the problem, the root of the issue, get the stewards to be a little bit more stricter, perhaps. And I appreciate let them race. I want them to be racing. Let them race. But there is a line, and there needs to be an established line, and for the drivers not to cross. But that could only be down to Michael Massey and the stewards.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And Courtney, I will come to you in a moment, because I know you want to weigh on this well, because Christian Horner did mention, and I don't think it was disrespectful to Michael Massey. I think it was, in a way, there was some truth to this, that he felt that the way everything was going in that race and how uncomfortable it was, it certainly felt like F1 missed the late Charlie Whiting. That kind of experience. Yes. And that, not necessarily, just drawing on that experience, but the conviction in not having to sort of backtrack on certain decisions, the wording or the terminology. I mean, it might be unpopular, but I actually was a fan of the deal, if you like, that he made with Red Bull, purely and simply because of the fact that because we had an immediate red flag after the restart, there was no opportunity for Max to give Lewis the place back. So to give Red Bull the option to say, well, because Max couldn't give the Lewis the place back, it's going to be referred to the stewards and he'll probably get a penalty. But to make this a little bit fair for you under the circumstances where you can't give the place back, we'll let you give him the place back on the grid. So it was a weird circumstance. I wouldn't encourage doing deals normally, and I didn't really like the terminology, but I can understand the rationale for it. Whether it was the right call or not, probably not within my power to say, but I thought that was better than putting Max in a position where he had no option to give Lewis the place back and gets penalised, even though he was wrong to overtake off the circuit. Courtney, I'm going to come to you on this one. I know you want to weigh on this because we talked a little bit about it before we came on. What are your thoughts on what George and I have just been talking about regarding Max and the inconsistency of the stewards, and by some extension, the fans' opinion of him over the years?
Well, yeah, I mean, we got one of our listeners actually contacted me on Instagram. Because I asked, you got any questions about the episode? And she made a fair point. She said, are the stewards sort of not afraid as such? Are they wary of, they don't want to have an impact on the outcome of the championship and affect, and be this season remembered for a steward's decision rather than, who won the championship? I mean, I can see that. I don't think the stewards want to get involved, but actually, because of their lack of involvement or lack of consistency, they've actually played a bigger role in this championship, and it's become a way bigger issue. So it's kind of, they've kind of gone against the desired effect, if that's what they were going for, because I can't remember last time we went through a race about talking about inconsistent stewarding, and I think this is the issue with because we heard Max on the radio at the end of the race saying, at least the fans understand because of the voting that he got. I know it isn't like an accurate representation of the fans' view overall. I think throughout the season I've had a real issue with Max's driving. And, I've already mentioned his management, but I think the stewards have also played a big part in this because, as you've both stated, if you set the rules out and you're firm with the rules, he will stop doing some of the things that he's doing. So then we'll get the fair, hard racing that we want to see within the rules that every single driver on the grid are aware of. And I think this season has been a real failure, from the stewards. And I think, I've mentioned it so many times. I'm so excited for next season because you have a real opportunity to see some real good talents like Leclerc, George Russell, hopefully Norris as well, get to showcase their talents and compete at the top. And you want to be seeing these drivers, fighting each other, but fairly and with consistent stewarding. We do not want to be talking about stewards. The way that we see in football, way too many football games are tainted by debates about VAR rather than the game itself. And that's how I feel about this season. I'm so pleased that we've got this finale that we're going to get, but we've spent way too much time talking about steward decisions. It shouldn't be like this.
Yeah, it's very much the stewards becoming victims of their own creation in that regard. And there does need to be some precedents put in place. I've heard rumours that they are considering talking to Max and Lewis before this Grand Prix and saying to both of them that if one of you decides to cause a collision between the two of you deliberately with the intention to win the championship through that method, you will be disqualified or excluded from the championship in the way that Michael Schumacher
Derek
was.
Warwick as well. Derek Warwick's doing it as well, so you don't want to mess with him.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, well, when Derek says something, he means business. So
yeah, he does.
Yeah,
hard taskmaster and certainly a very hard touring car driver as well. So I wouldn't want to mess with him at all.
No, I've heard, and I've seen. You definitely don't want to mess with Derek Warwick. But no, that's a really good point, George. Because it's like what happened with Schumacher in Jerez back in '97, and even then that was a very strange punishment to hand out. But I suppose when you're in that kind of situation, you kind of have to put the fear of God into both of those drivers, not implying that they would do something, but it's just to create a safeguard to kind of make them think twice about a possibility of doing that. Given how intelligent they both are behind the wheels, we saw in Jeddah what they were both trying to do, and ultimately just become an absolute mess where Max was rightfully punished for that. But as I said, there's so many confusing factors. George, you mentioned obviously the contrast between Brazil and in Jeddah. And that's what I got caught up on, annoyingly, because I said in Brazil, like you, that it was a stonewall penalty and that Max should have been given the 5-second time penalty. But then, of course, they didn't even investigate it properly. And that with the review, they just rubbished it off. So when you get to Jeddah and the same thing happens, I say, oh, well, in that case, on that precedent, it's not a penalty. And then all of a sudden there are people in the comments saying, well, it is a penalty. Well, I agree with you, but we're basing it on precedents that were set as far back as Austria, when we were questioning it back then, and we were praising Fernando Alonso and Lewis Hamilton in Hungary for the way that they were racing each other. It's such a fine line when it comes to hard racing and giving penalties, but the stewards have to set precedents, and not only that, they have to stick to them. They can't keep moving the goalposts based on circumstantial evidence. What was it? Michael Massey said that we're not going to judge these incidents based on the consequences of them, and then goes and makes decisions based on the consequences of them. You can't really, it's not an ideal world, we'd love it to be, but you can't really go back on something like that. Before we move on, guys, is there anything either of you wanted to add in? Because I know I'm sort of talking over a little bit before we move on to some of the other talking points in the paddock.
Yeah, no, go on. Go ahead, George.
No, I was just saying, no, I totally agree. And I personally feel, my biggest fear, and I don't like to throw the word scripted around, but my biggest fear is that Formula One is becoming scripted. I mean, there's such and do you know what? It's not. There's no proof to suggest this, but obviously there's been a lot of hype around the Drive to Survive Netflix series and things like that. And I think we're going to be in for a corker for that one when this one comes out. But there's a huge influx of new fans for Formula One coming in now, off the back of Drive to Survive. A lot more money coming into Formula One as well. Certainly with the Middle East now stepping in and hosting events and races, there's a lot of money in the Middle East, as everyone knows. Obviously, there's a lot of finance that can be generated through Formula One in that sense. And I do often think that, there's nothing quite like a good championship battle or good championship fight that can really generate income for an organization like Formula One. So there is that scary element that, maybe the stewards are sort of thinking about that, maybe as opposed to the race. I'm not insinuating anything, by the way, but I'm just saying that is a possibility. Now, if that is the case, then that's a very scary place to be in that sense, and that's my biggest fear. Because that would effectively be the end of Formula One at that point, as far as I'm concerned.
100%.
So I hope it doesn't go down that road, but just there's been many points this season where things have happened and somehow we end up on level points heading into the last race at Abu Dhabi, which is great. But at the same time, two big numbers alongside each other for the final race of the season does enough make you think a bit, doesn't it?
It does. And I'll tell you what, George, you mentioned Drive to Survive. I think the person who's got the dream job over this winter period or immediately after right now is the post-production editor for the series. He literally just has to press record and we'll just watch that.
Well, they've just written Rush 2 as well. The Rush 2 film will be
Have
out
they
soon
really?
as well. No, I'm just saying this could be it.
No.
Well done, Adam.
Yeah, I'm editing that part. It got me excited there. I was like, okay. I mean, do you know what? It's so silly because I'm literally not thinking about like Rush was
Well, if Ron
based on a
Howard's
true
watching,
story.
then Ron, get your pad out, mate.
Oh, well, that's it.
We got a film to write.
That's it. Literally, like for a minute there, for some reason, I just thought there's going to be like a sequel to not Rush, but a sequel to Lauda versus Hunt, without realising in history. Well, it wasn't quite exactly like that. It's been a long day. I'm not with it. Never mind. Adam's exposed at this point. He's done. Courtney, what's your final thoughts on this before we move on to the other talking points?
You know what? I think this is such an important weekend for Formula One as a sport moving forward. I mean, because of how exciting the season has been, the scenario that we found ourselves in, we're gonna have so many eyes on Formula One, a sport that we're all passionate about. So I really hope that we get obviously an entertaining race, a clean race, and let's hope nobody embarrasses themselves, whether it be the drivers, whether it be the team principals, or whether it be the stewards. All the eyes. It's like the World Cup final of Formula One. We don't get it often, so let's just hope that we get the spectacle that and we get to see the best of Formula One rather than the worst. Because I think over the last weekend in particular, that race I'd say it's probably been the most frustrated I've ever been watching a Formula One race for various reasons. And I think if we get a repeat of that in Abu Dhabi with so many eyes on the sport, it's not going to look good. So, come on, guys. Let's just hope everyone's on top form this weekend.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Definitely frustrating watching the Jeddah race, and hopefully we'll get an exciting season finale with no controversy whatsoever. Let's let the best man win, whoever that may be. It's wishful thinking, but you got to go with it's the hope that kills you, isn't it? Let's move on to some of the other stories in the paddock. The battle between Ferrari and McLaren. It's kind of come to a bit of an anticlimax almost, really. We were kind of expecting this one to go all the way to the very end. Technically, it sort of has. But it seems very unlikely that we're going to get that 38-odd point swing that McLaren need to overtake Ferrari for third in the Constructors' Championship. George, what have you made of the battle between Ferrari and McLaren this season? Who's impressed you the most between these two teams?
Well, it's been an extraordinary story in my view. I mean, we start the season where McLaren were the dominant force against Ferrari, really, from the get-go. Obviously, Lando has had a really sterling season, I think, with them. Obviously, a couple of hiccups. Obviously, we'll brush over Sochi a little bit, but if we look at it now, towards the tail end of the season, Ferrari have really come out fighting now. I mean, I think Carlos Sainz has been phenomenal. I think he's really been on top. If you look at each race weekend against a very strong driver like Charles Leclerc, I think Carlos Sainz has been absolutely brilliant, and almost goes on to be the unsung hero in Formula One, and sort of, no one really tends to notice him a lot of the time. But I've sort of paid close attention to Carlos. He's been absolutely brilliant. I sort of expected a better season from Daniel Ricciardo. I think a little bit. I think Lando Norris, has outperformed him a little bit this season, or quite a bit. But he's sort of come into his own towards the tail end of the season. I think this has sort of been the trouble with Daniel. I don't think he's settled anywhere yet, because he's changed quite a few teams, and since he's left, obviously Red Bull, he went to Renault. He's now found himself at McLaren. So there's been a lot of chopping and changing. I think the whole thing around Ricciardo, I think he needs to settle. But Sainz has been sensational. I think Ferrari are going to be better next year. I think they're going to be a far better team next year. I think it's evidently clear that they've been working on next year's car rather than this year's. But obviously, I think they must have made some subtle changes towards the tail end of the season to generate a little bit more performance. But I really am expecting the Scuderia to be high flyers. I think heading into 2022. McLaren have been strong, but I've sort of got the vibe that they were tailing off towards the end of the season.
Yeah, it very much felt that McLaren were certainly hitting their potential early on. They're certainly out of the gates faster. Ferrari had a good car, but there were certain elements of it, perhaps on the power unit side in particular, where they seemed to be lacking. And, as Lando Norris said much earlier in the season, that it felt that McLaren were doing everything right, particularly him. He was incredible. At one point, he was not fighting Lewis and Max for the championship, but it was certainly up there in the top three, quite far ahead of the other two that were driving much more superior cars. And then, of course, as the season went on, they seemed to tail off a bit, and Ferrari seemed to go into their stride, reach their potential to a point now where they look very much the third best team on the grid at the moment. And it certainly bodes well for them, both teams next year, not just Ferrari, of course. There's a lot of hope for McLaren because the start of the season, they were quite limited in what they could do with their car compared to everybody else, and they've done a relatively good job. So there is that hope that with another year behind them in Lando Norris and Daniel Ricciardo, who could do with a lot of prep in the winter break to kind of get himself back to where he was, it certainly bodes well for McLaren as well. And I'm quite intrigued with Ferrari's prospects as well. Obviously, there's an invested interest there for me, but Mattia Binotto said back in Turkey that they were going to unleash the full capacity of this power unit in the final race. And he said that with the mindset that Ferrari and McLaren were going to literally be neck and neck as we'd kind of hoped for. But even though that's not necessarily the case, are we expecting that to be actually fulfilled and that Ferrari might actually get involved in the Red Bull Mercedes fight this weekend? Or is that a bit too optimistic? What are your thoughts on that one, Courtney?
I think that's a bit too much. I feel that particularly the level that Lewis and Max are setting, I think the way that, because they're pushing each other so much, we saw the way they just like completely left everyone behind them for dust. I just think they're just on that level. Whereas I think most of the other drivers will be on the beach, let's say. I think a lot of them are just going to enjoy the last race without that pressure. So I don't think they'll be strong enough to have an impact on Lewis versus Max. But I think for Ferrari as a team, I've been impressed with the rhetoric coming from inside Ferrari. I think my biggest criticism for Ferrari, particularly around the time that Sebastian Vettel left, is that because they're the biggest team in Formula One, there's always been this pressure to deliver, but they've always had this sort of overconfidence, always come across that they feel they have a divine right to be at the very front of the grid. And that's actually led to their downfall. They've started well, and if things don't go well, they've got the pressure from the fans. There's been some changes in the management. I've noticed in the last couple of seasons, they basically said, look, we're building long-term here. Be patient with us. And we've seen it from the fans. There hasn't been any outrage from the fans this season because Ferrari aren't the very front, because you're looking forward to next year. I think it's a massive, massive season for Ferrari coming up. They have to deliver. But I've got, like you, George, I've got a sneaking suspicion that Ferrari could be one of, if not the top teams this next season. The way that we saw with Mercedes, we saw Mercedes saying, in 2011, even 2012, that they're going to be focusing on the 2014 regulations. And as we've seen, the rest is history. So I do expect Ferrari and possibly McLaren to be right up there next season.
Yeah. There's a lot of good points there. And as you're right, Ferrari have made some structural changes. Obviously, Laurent Meeks is very much involved in the race day operations a lot more than Mattia Binotto, who seems to take a more of a technical role at the factory a bit more. I just noticed George in the corner.
Just going to take the cat out.
Yeah, got a bit of a guest in the background trying to get out there. Yeah. For those of you not watching on YouTube, George's cat has just popped into the background. Looks like he's trying to get out the poor thing, bless him. And so yeah, I'm going to narrate this. So George lets his cat out. He's gone. George sits back in his seat.
I forgot she was there, to be honest.
Well, I mean, we've been recording for nearly an hour now. So I only just noticed a shadow in the background behind your seat, and then I just saw a cat emerge. It was like,
yeah, I saw on my webcam monitor it was coming through, and I was like, Oh, right. Okay. Pepper's there.
Oh, well, that's always a nice special guest there. We've got George featuring Pepper as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were just saying, George, whilst I was doing a bit of a narration on what was going on for the benefit of those, our listeners that don't watch the podcast on YouTube, because they'd have no idea what I was talking about, seeing a cat in the background. But the Ferrari's prospects do look good. Obviously, Lauren Meeks' involvement in the team in terms of the race day operations and obviously running this, being involved with the team, the decisions that they're making. Mattia Binotto, as I said, he's been much more involved in the factory, and it's a big project at Ferrari. Then there's a lot of talk on this 2022 power unit, which is going to be oh so critical for so many teams owing to the engine freeze for the next few seasons afterwards. And Ferrari are going on a very radical concept change. They're not confiding with the twin turbo system that Mercedes have adopted and Alpine are deciding to go towards, and Honda to a degree as well. So it's a huge gamble, but there's a lot of voices in and outside the Ferrari paddock, if you like, or inside the Ferrari hub that seem rather confident that this could be a game changer for them. I suppose we'll have to wait and see, and if it is, it's going to be fantastic for Formula One. I just really hope McLaren join them in this fight as well. As much as I want to see Ferrari up there for my own interests, I want to see McLaren up there as well. There's nothing better in my mind, at least, than seeing those four teams fighting at the front. Of course, Red Bull and Mercedes being the other two. George, before we move on to the final few parts of this episode, is there anything else you wanted to add regarding the Ferrari and McLaren resurgence for 2022?
I think going off what you're saying, I totally agree. And these are teams that should be at the top of the sport, because they've been at the helm. I mean, right from when Bruce McLaren was in Formula One, and then of course, the introduction of Ferrari as well in Formula One when Formula One was effectively born, shall we say, all the way back in the 50s. I mean, these are two great teams with almighty heritage in the sport, very much like Williams as well, and many other teams that are in this championship. It would be a crime not to see them back up there one day. And I firmly believe that we will see the best of McLaren and Ferrari again. I think if you look at where McLaren have been, over the past few years, I think they've made such great strides. I think Zach Brown and many of the others and Andreas Seidel now, of course, as well, can be absolutely delighted with the progress that they have made. Bringing McLaren back to where they should be. You're having Lando Norris even in contention of winning Grand Prix, Daniel Ricciardo getting a podium as well. I think that is exactly what they've needed. Really at this point, so I'm well chuffed to see them there, and it wouldn't be a far gone conclusion, I think, to see them back at the top. I think, and certainly getting closer next season.
Yeah, absolutely right. Hopefully it happens for them, because it's a great resurgence, and it seems that there's one more big step to go, but they're certainly capable of achieving that with the people that they've got on board. I just wanted to chuck in a few driver names briefly, just to sort of assess how they've been this season. We've seen the return of Fernando Alonso this season. There have been some great moments, the old Fernando that you like, that have kind of teased us this idea that if Fernando is in a competitive car next season, that he could potentially be in a championship fight or maybe fighting for race wins. George, how have you rated Fernando's first season back in Formula One so far? Rookie of the Year potential, or do you feel that this potentially could be the highlight of his return?
I think the biggest point, I think, for Fernando was Hungary. I think what we saw him do to Lewis to effectively hand Esteban Ocon the win, I thought was extraordinary. And I think we've sort of seen a bit of a change in Fernando, I think, and probably a side I don't think we necessarily saw in previous seasons. He's willing to play the team game a lot more than perhaps what he used to. Obviously, he used to be the superstar back in the years when he was at Ferrari and, of course, at Renault before. Of course, now at Alpine, he sort of he's taken more of a team role. He's sort of guiding Alpine now, and I think they're a lot better now or certainly a lot better with his sort of view on things. I think now that he is closely working with the team and obviously helping Esteban as well. They seem to have a great relationship. I, for one, was a little dubious as to how Esteban and Fernando would get on at the start of the season. I thought it was a slightly strange driver lineup heading into the start of the year, but they, since coming out of it, I think they've been brilliant, and you've seen the camaraderie between the pair of them. Certainly at Hungary, when Esteban Ocon said, "I owe you one," and all that. I think that's brilliant. But yeah, it's great to see a lot more of the team element coming into Fernando, a lot more than it used to. And I think that is great, because I think there's a big sense around Fernando that due to his qualities in a car, that he was painted as this sole figure at a team. And he was very much painted that way at McLaren when he was there as well. You'd hear Zach Brown talking about him, that it's all about Fernando and all this kind of stuff. And it's never really true. And I think Fernando sort of proved a point by saying, I am capable of playing the team game. So for me, it's been a real positive season for him, I think.
Yeah, I very much agree. I very much enjoyed the Hungary race. I think that battle with Lewis there's certainly a nostalgia bias to it. And it was just great to see hard racing at its absolute finest. I think that is the template. That and also with George Russell.
That's what we need.
Yeah.
That's what we need at Yas Marina.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think personally.
Yeah, absolutely right. And the George Russell race in Austria. I think that is the template for hard racing. It's quite ironic that Fernando was involved in both, and the old famous that you have to leave the space, that comment. But it does epitomise. And you see all these on social media as well. I think there was another one, like Italy, was it 2012, 2013, when he was battling with Vettel, and Vettel was just about on the grass, but it was literally on the ragged edge of how hard you can race someone and keep it fair. And I think that's something we need to see more in the coming years, and hopefully we will. Hopefully that sort of thing can be set in place and inspire.
That's why we all love Fernando.
Absolutely. I can't think of a reason not to, but I'm sure plenty of people in the comments probably will for me. But another driver I want to talk about, Pierre Gasly. Courtney, I know you and I have spoken quite a lot about him. I'll come to you on this one as well. I'm interested to get George's thoughts on Gasly's season, but it's been a year for AlphaTauri where there's been a lot of promise, a lot of expectation, given what we saw in pre-season tests, and it seemed that they had a car capable of winning the midfield battle with Ferrari and McLaren included in that. And there was a time towards the end of this season that it looked like AlphaTauri were going to overhaul Alpine, but then of course we had that nightmare race for them in Qatar, which promised so much, and then ended up seeing a podium for Alpine, and I think it was a P5 as well for Esteban Ocon. So it's kind of all come crashing down on them a little bit. They've had to settle for P6, but Pierre Gasly has been without doubt the highlight. Over 100 points this season, which is an incredible feat considering the machinery that he has compared to the rest of the field. Once again, I have to ask, is this a driver that should be setting his sights beyond 2022 to think perhaps I could put myself in line for a big drive in the future? Surely the bigger teams have to be keeping an eye on him for 2022 and beyond that.
I mean, I personally thought that the Alpine seat could have been an option for him in a couple of years, but it looks like they're building something good there. I think the problem for Pierre Gasly, and I think Yuki Tsunoda's been given a lot of grief this season, so I'm not going to stick to that subject for too long. But you have a look at that Alpine AlphaTauri battle. Both drivers at Alpine have got the big results. Obviously, Ocon got the win. Fernando Alonso got the podium, and then also obviously Ocon was very close to getting the podium in the last race. Gasly's been consistently good, particularly in qualifying. The amount of top 5 starts he's had this season has been crazy when you think about the package that he has. But when it comes to the race-defining moments, he hasn't had the teammate to back him up the way that we've seen with Ocon and Alonso. And I think if this partnership continues, I can see him getting frustrated at AlphaTauri. I'm sure he's grateful to have a seat in Formula One because he could have lost it when he left Red Bull. He could have lost a seat in Formula One altogether. It's just, I think the problem for Pierre Gasly is that all the big drivers have sort of become settled. If you have a look at Mercedes, you're gonna have Hamilton and Russell. Maybe if Hamilton retires next season, that might be an option. Ferrari, Red Bull, McLaren, all the teams that are going to be up there in the coming years, they look pretty stable. So I think he's just gonna have to continue doing what he's doing. But I think Tsunoda needs to up his game next season.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. I think there's been a lot of that this season. George, I'm interested to get your thoughts on Pierre Gasly this season. As we've said already, there's been a lot of high points for him. Of course, the highlight of his career so far, that win at Monza, which was a testament to his character, his ability to bounce back literally from the brink of his F1 career. And this season, we've kind of seen him go on another level in terms of consistency. His qualifying performances have been exemplary, arguably one of the best qualifiers this season, if not the best pound-for-pound qualifier this season. And, there have been times where I think in the race, whilst the car has dropped off, people have kind of given him credit where it's due, that he would probably be able to achieve more if it weren't for mistakes his team made or the car that he was in, which kind of puts him in the frame for a big seat in the future. Do you feel that there is a route back to Red Bull at Gasly? And if not, what other teams do you think should be taking a serious look at him?
Personally, if I was Pierre Gasly, and by the way, I'm a huge supporter of Pierre Gasly. I mean, despite me being a neutral when it comes to Formula One, I hold a lot of respect and I take a lot of enjoyment out of watching Pierre Gasly when he races. I think he's superb behind the wheel of a car. Don't think he got the fair rub of the green at Red Bull. Personally, I feel that there was a lot more going on in that team at that point, and I don't think it's necessarily fair to point it at Gasly, to be quite honest, because I get the feeling that, as much as people maybe don't like to say it, I think that car was built for Max in a sense at that time. But since he's moved back to AlphaTauri, he's been phenomenal. Several strings of fourth finishes, finishing ahead in some cases is higher than Valtteri Bottas and Sergio Perez, of course, who is now in the seat of his former car. I think he's been a real standout. And I think, going off what Courtney's saying as well, the main problem that's hit AlphaTauri is that they've been very one-legged all season long. There's been one driver effectively doing the work, I think, at this point. Of course, Yuki coming in, we know what the reasoning behind having Yuki in the team was. Obviously, Honda being who they are, Japanese manufacturer of engines. Having Yuki in the car was sort of, as I understand it, part of the deal, should we say? And certainly going into the final, I believe the final season agreement of the engine agreement that they have. I think obviously there was such a huge emphasis on having a Japanese driver in the car, which is great. It's great for the sport as well, and again introduces, I suppose, greater influence to the Japanese audience as well, which is superb. Gasly for me has been phenomenal, and I loved it when he won at Monza. I really enjoyed him coming third, beating Hamilton at Brazil as well, getting that podium that day. And for me, he is such a talent, and for me, a talent that is ready for a big seat. He is so ready, and I'll be honest with you, the way I've seen it going for quite some time, I can see him partnering George Russell at Mercedes on Lewis Hamilton's retirement. For me, that is the perfect combination. At the end of the day, if George Russell fails to bring the big results, I feel that Pierre would be the man to bring home the result on the day. So I think, and I don't think Gasly would really be too worried about taking a second driver role at Mercedes if it came to that.
No, perhaps a fresh start is what he needs. Whilst the door at Red Bull isn't exactly slammed shut as much as we thought it might have been in the past, particularly with Dr. Helmut Marko, who seemed to be extended an olive branch to him at times. It does seem perhaps more likely that a move elsewhere at a team like Mercedes or McLaren or perhaps somewhere else might necessarily be one that entices him a bit more. Maybe we see a potential future World Championship challenge from Pierre Gasly. It certainly sounds exciting. I'm aware of time, so I'm going to move this on to a few end of season goodbyes, unfortunately. And the first of which, of course, we know that Honda is going to be leaving the sport, sort of, at the end of the season to pursue the greener energy initiatives that we talked about earlier in the season. Of course, Antonio Giovinazzi is going to be leaving at the end of this race to pursue a career in Formula E. And of course, whilst Gio has had some good moments, ultimately I think we could all agree that some of the performances he's put in more recently would have been better off done much earlier in the season and perhaps given a better chance. But it's a shame that we have to say goodbye to some drivers, but that's the brutal nature of Formula One, really. You have to be on it, otherwise you're going to find yourself replaced very quickly. But I want to talk about Kimi Raikkonen, a driver who very much has divided opinion in more recent years between some of the younger fans and some of the older fans in terms of how they interpret his radio communications. I mean, we know we're all in an age now where respect and be kind are very much at the forefront on how we should communicate online and on radio and to other personnel we work with, and I absolutely agree with that. And in a way, that message has kind of been used to sort of how people interpret Kimi Raikkonen's radio message. The famous one, I think it was back in 2013, Abu Dhabi, in the Lotus, when he was saying to his team engineer, "Leave me alone, I know what I'm doing," when he won that race. Or some of the other one that Kimi has said when he gets aggressive on the radio, that we love him for, because that's Kimi for you. But It's a Formula One career that's lasted 20 years, albeit the sabbatical period for a few seasons in the early 2010s. And it's seen him win one world championship, Ferrari's last world champion, which still hurts to say. It does, but, you know, he's still there. But a driver that has achieved so much in the sport. I'm going to hand the floor over to you guys to weigh in on this. How much of a loss will Kimi be to Formula One? Not necessarily just for his career and what he's achieved, but in terms of the character, the fanfare around Kimi Raikkonen, which is as popular as anybody is on the grid. How big of a loss is this for Formula One to finally say goodbye to Kimi Raikkonen?
I think he's unique. I think that's certainly the best way of putting it. I think with quite a few seasons now, you know, particularly the world that we live in today, I think a lot of the drivers are sort of trained to give sort of predictable answers. But I think Kimi Raikkonen's sort of his personality's kind of kept that alive. And I think, you know, we're starting to see some of the younger drivers coming through a little bit more sort of willing to have a laugh and engage because they've seen the reaction that Kimi's got. So I think in a strange way, he's kind of been like the godfather of that kind of mentality, which we're now seeing with the younger drivers. So he's definitely left a mark in Formula One. I think the only thing I look back on, really, which is a bit of a shame, is that despite being a world champion, I think he's going to be remembered more from the general fan base for the sort of the memes, let's say, that he was involved with, than the actual racing. I've always thought with Kimi Raikkonen, particularly look back to his time at McLaren, he was supremely fast. He honestly, he was. I used to love watching Kimi race, and I just think with that sort of mindset that he has, as funny as it is to watch as fans, I just think that talent of his was wasted. I think people forget how quick the guy was.
No, absolutely agree. I think social media kind of, because it was introduced on some platforms like 2005, 2000, even later than that, I think, for Twitter, it's hard to remember or talk about those moments on those platforms. For me, as much as a Schumacher fan I am, 2003 Kimi Raikkonen should have won the World Championship. He was just unlucky with reliability issues. 2005 was the same. Fernando, you know, worthy champion, but Kimi was phenomenal. I think that was the best version of Kimi Raikkonen. I think we saw Suzuka that year coming back from 17th on the grid, I think it was, or 18th, to win the Grand Prix on the final lap was incredible. Similar hallmarks to what we saw with Lewis at Brazil this season. And, you know, the World Championship he did win was kind of justice for that, and the moments he provided, the comic relief as well, and the simplicity of a Finnish driver taken to even more extremes. I mean, we're all old enough to remember Mika Hakkinen, how straightforward he was with his answers, literally one-word answers, and Kimi to the point where now he's made a sigh into a one-word answer. It's just legendary stuff. And that's what I'm going to miss about Kimi, that sort of light-hearted relief that you get from someone who's just out there to have fun and race. He's not taking it too seriously, and that's what we love about Kimi. He's just literally the everyman, I suppose, of Formula One. George, what is Kimi Raikkonen's career, or what highlights does he have that have kind of left a footnote in your F1 memories, I suppose, if that's the right way of expressing it? I mean, what has Kimi Raikkonen meant to you in his career?
Well, I look back to his introduction back in 2001 when he joined the Sauber team. I thought that was extraordinary. I mean, he came in with so much promise, of course, winning, in the feeder series, and this talent that everyone had been highlighting was going to be a real force for the future. I believe he skipped a series to get into Formula One as well. And there were a lot of talk going around as to whether he would be eligible to compete in Formula One when he joined. And there was a lot of hard work in getting him into the Sauber team in the initial stages. But ultimately, it was Mika Hakkinen who actually directed him to the path of McLaren in the first place. Obviously, both from Finland. It just worked out that way. But he is so brilliantly and comedically no nonsense. It is superb to watch, and a pleasure to watch as well. He's a supremely good driver, very well deserving of the World Championship and the World Championships and the race wins that he's won. And he will be sorely missed, I think, as of next season. I think what he did with Lotus was brilliant. Probably, again, someone who deserves a little bit more attention than than what he's received. I think what he's done, despite the technological advances, because you look back at the cars from 2001 and you don't have half the things on the car back then as you do nowadays. So the fact that he is able to drive throughout those different eras of Formula One, I think is astonishing, and I think it's well worth to be remembered, not to mention still being competitive as well, because of course still very much in the fight, making overtakes. I think that deserves greater adulation than than anything else, really. Just his supreme staying nature in the sport, I think, has got to be applauded.
Yeah, absolutely well put. I couldn't agree more. It was only a couple of years ago when Kimi was winning his final Grand Prix at the US race back in 2018, and he will be sorely missed in the sport. He certainly left a lot of memories in many F1 fans' hearts, and on that note, I'm gonna push you both for a favourite Kimi Raikkonen moment, if you can draw it to one in particular that stands out for you the most. Courtney, I'm going to come to you first because you have one in mind, I imagine, quite early on.
Yep, it's the moment in Brazil when Martin Brundle messaged him and he asked him. He said, "Kimi, you missed a presentation by Pele," and he said, "I was having a."
You can finish that sentence if you want. I don't think YouTube's going to shadow ban us for one swear word. So for the benefit of the audience that don't know the rest of that quote, Courtney, that weren't watching on YouTube, what did Kimi say?
I was having a sheet.
There we go. George, dare I say that was a similar one for you, or do you have another one? I'm sure there's plenty to choose from.
There's quite a few to pick from. I thought gloves and steering wheel was quite good. That was quite entertaining. Kimi, you want to have the drink?
Yeah.
I mean, that was a brilliant one. And there was also something as well I was watching the other day. In fact, I was doing a little bit of content for somebody with regards to this one, and this was something to do with a loose panel in behind his seat, and I think it was the air filter or something going into the car, and it was loose or something on the back, and he was saying, how hard is it to attach a thing on the back of the car? He was saying to his engineer, because it kept on hitting him in the back, I think, while he was driving. He was driving him a bit crazy. But many moments. I mean, Bois as well has become a meme as well on Twitter, and as well as many other things. So he has given a lot to the sport, and just the very fact, I think he's immortalized himself in memes. I think so. I think it'll be very, very difficult to forget about Kimi Raikkonen. I think for me, there's two that stand out, and I'll be brief about the second one because it's a little bit of a story. But the one that stands out to me, it's not even a Formula One moment. It's just when they were sitting to record Drive to Survive. I can't remember if it's last season's one or the one before. And they're going for all the drivers about what it means to be a Formula One driver, the pressures and the exhilaration and the ambition and everything else. And then it just brilliantly cuts to Kimi at the end of about 5 or 6 of them. And he just goes, just a hobby for me. That one. Just the way that it was edited was absolutely brilliant. It just kind of breaks the tension and makes you laugh just because of how funny it is. But one of my favourite ones was a story that David Coulthard had and Jensen Button about Kimi Raikkonen. And this was back in Monaco, back in the early 2000s. And they were in the casino hotel, which of course they both had a stake in owning at the time. And there was this big party for some of the F1 drivers. And they'd seen someone stumbling across and shouting and drinking a lot. And someone literally collapsed right in front of their feet. And it turned out it was Kimi Raikkonen. Literally just having way too much drink. And I think a few of you might remember, some of you listening will remember the presentation at the end of the season a few years ago where Sebastian Vettel and Kimi were teammates, and Kimi got absolutely drunk and was literally presenting on stage as if he was a presenter, and Seb had to sort of escort him off just because he completely had too much to drink. I mean, Kimi knows how to live, that's all I will say, and he's going to be missed in the sport. Absolute fantastic stuff. I think I remember hearing Lewis Hamilton saying that Kimi likes to party.
Oh yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
Was it talking about? I think it was the. Trying to think what it was, because they were all sitting together, weren't they? And he mentioned that, and Kimi's just sitting there straight.
Yeah,
I think they were just asking like, "You can have a party after." And Kimi's like, "What?"
He just has a drink. He's like Jekyll and Hyde. He has one drink, and then party on, dude.
There you go. Well, it's like obviously the ice cream moment in Malaysia for Ferrari, and obviously was quite famous. And going on the yacht. I think was it 2005 when his engine went kaput in Monaco and he went onto the yacht. I mean, that was pretty cool. That is literally peak Kimi right there. Look, we could go on about Kimi Raikkonen for ages. Deserves a separate podcast episode in its own right. But now that we've come to the end of the show, guys, for this episode, I'm going to push you both, and I know we've kind of alluded to this already. I'm not going to ask for a top 3 or pole position or anything like this. I'm just going to ask one simple question. At the end of the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, who is going to be the 2021 World Champion? Courtney, I'm going to let you go first.
Lewis Hamilton.
George?
Lewis Hamilton.
As much as I'd like to stick with what I predicted at the start of the season, I'm going to go with the main man, Lewis Hamilton, to be world champion. It would be nice if I'm wrong, but the momentum is definitely in Lewis's corner. So yeah, Lewis Hamilton. But guys, of course, that is the end of the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix preview. I just want to say a massive thank you to our guest, George Morgan, who's been absolutely phenomenal on this show. Really enjoyed talking to you, George. It's just, I don't want to keep you too much longer because you've been on quite a while already and I don't want to take up too much more of your time. But thank you so much for coming on the show. As we've mentioned already, George is going to be very busy next year. Of course, some adventures he can't reveal to us, as much as I was tempted to ask and try anyway, but never mind. If you want to follow George and check out more of his stuff, as George mentioned, George Morgan TV on Instagram, Twitter, and of course his YouTube channel as well. I'll leave the links in the description below on YouTube. And of course, incidentally, if you do want to subscribe to the DNF1 channel, then make sure you can on YouTube. Just hit that subscribe button for more great episodes like this. And of course, more content coming over the winter break, which we can't wait to share with you. Of course, if you have enjoyed this episode, please make sure to leave a like as well and comment below who you think is going to be the 2021 World Champion. Will it be Max? Will it be Lewis? And leave in your favourite Kimi Raikkonen moment as well while you're at it. But until next time, guys, we've been DNF1 and we will see you in the next episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. Take care.
See you soon.